Hello, this is Brian Kinghorn and I'm going to talk to you today about the second in a series of videos on other features in Matesel, and this is committed matings. So that sounds a little bit like something to do with your wedding vows, but that's not the case. It's more to do with managing diversity across the full life cycle or a full generation of individuals rather than just the group of individuals you're dealing with at the current mating round. So what is a committed mating? It's one of two things. It's either a mating that you have already made, this is generally the case, and you need Matesel to accommodate that information about that past mating in the current analysis, and why you need to do that I'll explain in just a moment. The alternative is that it's simply a mating that you insist must be made for your own reasons. So you may have semen in the tank and you might want a particular cow to be mated to a particular bull and you want that to be part of the solution, then you can use this feature for that. Your Matesel solution is forced to include all of your committed matings in that solution. So here is a description of the problem. Let's say that we're here now in 2021 and we have these male candidates to consider for making mate allocations, selections and mate allocations. However, in the previous year there have been a number of matings made, and these have resulted in progeny that are juvenile and too young to be included as candidates in the current year. That means that the progeny from these matings are not included in the calculation of parental co-ancestry, which is this little formula here, and which is the x-axis on our Matesel frontier. The x vector here is the vector of contributions of individuals, and so for example Spotty Bill over here, who is not on the list of candidates for this year, will not be represented at all, of course, in this parental co-ancestry. Now the basic problem here is that if we take Lucky Jack for example, he might be quite a good bull and we want to allocate quite a lot of females to him. But the fact that he's been used in the previous year quite extensively is not taken into account because these matings here are not represented in the parental co-ancestry and the analysis doesn't know about the fact that he's been used a lot. Whereas in truth, we should have some inhibitory effect on the amount of use of Lucky Jack because he's got so many progeny in the pipeline. And that not only goes for Lucky Jack, but for example, Boy George might be his son, in which case there should be some level of inhibition on Boy George as well. And it means that individuals that are not used or little used in the previous year are more new blood in the current year and should have a higher probability of being used or not used because they're simply not good enough on index. So the solution to this problem is committed matings, and what we do is we make the parents in these recent matings be candidates in the Matesel run. They may already be candidates, but if they're not, then we include them in there, and we force the allocation of these matings that have already taken place, so they will be a part of the result. And we have to make sure that there are enough uses available for these individuals to cover both these existing matings and any new matings that should be made. So these old matings or committed matings now contribute to parental co-ancestry, and that influences the selections and mating decisions that are made for the current mating round. And implementation of committed matings is reasonably straightforward. First of all, in Matesel.ini you need to have a switch for controlling committed matings, and that's either 0 for off and two different settings, 1 and 2. We'll talk about the difference between those. And then you need to have a file called CommittedMatings.txt, and here it is. And this is just a file, header, sire and dam, and just a list of the matings that are in that CommittedMatings.txt file. Matings that have been made in the past, usually. So here you can see when you make that run, you'll get some information on the console about the total number of new matings that you want to make, which was 50 in that Matesel.ini. The total number of committed matings in that file was 58, so that's a representation of that file here, and the total number of matings is 108. And then when the analysis is proceeding, the frontier is calculated using all of those matings, and that is always shown on the frontier, and we have different ways of showing committed and new matings, as we'll talk about later in this video. So let's look at CommittedMatings.txt. That's a file that you maintain between different runs, typically in a pig or poultry operation that will be done weekly. And what you do is between each round you add the matings that have been made into CommittedMatings.txt, and you delete or weed out those matings where the progeny have already left the pipeline in one way or other, and that is they've become candidates themselves, or they have been culled, or they die. Now, of course, there are many different ways of managing such things. We're doing it rather simply here by just simply noting that these matings have been made and not second guessing the value of them, for example, by taking account of updated EBVs of those progeny. And it's likely that such refinements probably don't have a great deal of effect and would be much more complicated to implement. So we think we've got a reasonable handle of accommodating overlapping generations and full life cycle by this straightforward approach. To use committed matings, well, first of all, you supply your list in CommittedMatings.txt as described before, but that setting in Matesel.ini should either be 1 or 2. If it's 1, there's automatic setting of the maximum use of each individual's. So you set max use per candidate for the new matings alone, and Matesel will automatically make adjustments for the committed matings that you supply in that file. And this is typical for use in, for example, beef and sheep. However, sometimes people will use setting number 2, which is manual setting of max use. Here you set max use per candidate over committed plus new matings. That means, for example, if you wanted to have a complete season of breeding, many runs of Matesel, and you wanted to set the maximum use per candidate over that whole season, then you would set that maximum use at the beginning of your season and maintain it throughout, apart from adjustments that might sensibly be made. So this is typical in aquaculture and probably programs involving stored semen and IVF, for example, in, again, beef and sheep, where you want to manage the use of individual sires in particular throughout a whole breeding season. Now, sometimes people have been getting mixed up between those two and doing not quite the right thing. However, we have a lot of warning messages when we pick up things that are likely to have been done incorrectly. So look out for those and read the console if you do have a problem, and you'll probably find that it points you to something which hasn't been done correctly in setting this up. So now I'll move on to a bit of a discussion about the situations where it might be more useful to use committed matings, and there's a good contrast here when we consider pigs versus cattle. And typically in pigs, the number of candidates that we've got in new matings required for a run, typically weekly, they are rather small in number compared to the long tail in the pipeline. And this is a bit like a dog with a long tail, and the tail is so big that it's wagging the dog and having quite a big influence. And this is where taking account of that tail, which is essentially the committed mating, so the parents of all these embryos, fetuses and juveniles are committed matings. And so that might be a whole year's worth of pipeline, whereas you're dealing with just 1 week's worth of active new decisions. So even though we might have relatively few candidates available for weekly matings, we still have pregnant females, for example, that are in the pipeline, but they're not in this pipeline. However, they are represented because their embryos, fetuses and juveniles will be represented in this pipeline, so they as parents will be taken into account. So if we contrast this with cattle, we find that we generally have quite a large number of individuals over different ages available for mating at a mating decision period, and the pipeline compared to pigs is relatively small. So the importance of taking account of this pipeline tends to be smaller than it is for pigs. And so in early work on beef, we found that the importance of committed matings being accommodated was not high, and in fact, we could get a similar outcome by having a bit more of a conservative approach and having more target degrees on the frontier. And you can read about that in this paper. However, I'll go on and look a little bit more about the situation where committed matings is really quite important, and we found that in simulations in pigs. But before going there, let's just look at another situation a little bit similar to pigs. And this is what we see in prawns and salmon, probably other aquaculture species, and probably in beef and sheep and dairy cattle operations where you have stored semen and IVF. So over here we have a representation of the current mating season and the adults that are available for mating in that season. We've already had some matings made earlier in the season. We will have some matings later on in the season. And in this particular Matesel analysis for the matings that are going to be made today, we just have a relatively small number of individuals. However, in this case, not only do we have committed matings represented as the parents of embryos and fingerlings or larvae and juveniles, but we've also got those parents that were themselves directly used earlier in the season. So these are all committed matings. There's an extra couple of features in this one which is typical for a comprehensive analysis. And one is to consider future matings, because we know about these individuals. They're not quite available to mate yet because they're not ripe, perhaps. So they're put into a separate group, group 2 for males and also a group 2 for females. And these are allocated to each other in the analysis. But of course, no action is taken on those matings because we're not ready to make them. But it does allow us to consider what we do today as a function of the decisions we might make in the future. We might also be making selections amongst juveniles, and there may be a certain group of juveniles that are available for selection and culling, and that can be done simultaneously as another group in the analysis. So we can have quite a lot going on here, accommodating decisions made earlier in the breeding season, as well as culling of juveniles, and also thinking about what might we do in the future, so that we balance out, in this case using the option 2 for manual use of max use. We would probably be balancing out the overall use of individuals throughout a mating season. That would be the case for stored semen in beef and dairy, where we could use a male right throughout the season, whereas for prawns and salmon that might not be the case, where they can only be used at one time. So now with the lights on, I'll show you the results of our simulations in pigs. And we've used our program PopSim, adjusted it to work weekly with weekly decisions made by Matesel on mate allocations and mate selections. And we're just going to look at the one comparison between committed matings at 25 degrees and control treatment at 50 degrees in purple and orange. And here are those results on the left for parental co-ancestry and on the right response to selection. So one thing to note here is that we have a foundation population, true breeding value sitting at 100, and that is going for a whole year for that foundation population with no change. And you can see the impact of that over future generations, in fact, and with overlapping generations that static effect is coming out. So that's just a feature of this analysis. We can see it as well with mean parental co-ancestry, of course, starting at 0 and the control treatment going up here. Now, with committed matings, as matings get added to CommittedMatings.txt, we find that the co-ancestries are going down. And that's because we're getting a bigger and bigger effective population size because there are more candidates. So don't be put off by this big change in mean parental co-ancestry. It's not a real effect. It's just because we've got more pigs involved in calculation of mean parental co-ancestry. What is important is the rate of increase. And we can see that with the committed mating strategy, we've got a lower, in fact 28% lower rate of increase in co-ancestry. So that's a big benefit. Meanwhile, on the response to selection side, we've actually achieved a higher rate of gain, and the rate of gain has been 19% higher on response to selection. So it seems that the value in a population structure such as with pigs is quite high, and indeed in pigs and poultry and in other species, committed matings have been adopted as a feature in Matesel quite strongly and quite widely. So we'll now go on to look at viewing results in Matesel. So now you can look at results for new matings in blue or committed matings in light yellow, and these should be fixed for everything except for individual co-ancestry. We'll talk about that later. And you can look at the combination of the two with committed matings stacked on top of new matings. Why do we do this? Well, let's look at this one here. If we wanted to get rid of this particular mating here by setting a maximum at a boundary and pushing hard, well, nothing will happen because this is actually a committed mating. It's already made and it can't be unmade. So it's better to be able to see all these things as we can do that now. Let's take that one off and look at another issue here. If we go to yearling weight and let's set tactical desired gain stabilizing at a certain value. I'll maximize this. Let's say we want to come up here and I'll invoke that and resume. Well, the red tick doesn't seem to be getting there, and that's because it's representing the average of all matings, not just the new matings. And that's the message here, is that what we're looking at doing with manipulations is changing the outcome for new matings. So you should always be viewing new matings when you do this. And you can see we have actually met our target. Here it is here. But if you were to view it for, of course, committed matings or for all matings, it would look as though we haven't met our target. So just be aware of that one. Okay, I'll uninvoke that. And we can see we have the same features for markers, where we can see committed or new matings alone. And with progeny inbreeding, it's the same again. We do have 3 ticks where we have the average inbreeding coefficient and the inbreeding coefficient that we would achieve if we randomly mated the selected animals. And we can choose to look at the committed matings alone, again, new matings or results for all matings. These radio buttons that we see down here, they don't exist for individual co-ancestry. Now let me lead up to showing you why that is. If we look at this for male parents, we see we've got what in natural fact is a single sire that we'll look for later. And what I want to be able to do is to move that sire's co-ancestry downwards. Well, how can we do that? Well, if we set a maximum to boundary, let's put it there and run that, then you'll see the co-ancestry has moved down. So for committed matings, we have changed results. And that is because this is the weighted mean co-ancestry with all selected individuals. So for an existing sire in a committed mating, what we are doing is we're changing the rest of the population to the extent that that sire is more new blood, because the rest of the population has become a bit less related to it. So that's why we don't have the option of viewing different levels of information here, because committed matings are always important for viewing individual co-ancestries, and that's why that's done. So let's look for this sire. It could be a number of sires, but it's 40 matings. If we go to mate selections and update that, then I can sort on co-ancestry, get the highest, and there we see Wayne, which is 0.836, and there he is up here. That's his value if we're to look at it. There he is about there. And we can see that he's got a maximum use of 40 matings. And yet, if we were to bring over the file which shows us what that is set at, it's the male max use is set at 25. The reason he's got 40 matings is because he's in CommittedMatings.txt with 15 matings plus 25 for new matings. That means his maximum use is 40, and he's been used to that amount. So you'll see here, for example, that Rodney has got 6 matings. Now all sires have got a max use for new matings at 25. However, Rodney is not in the list of candidates for new matings. He's only there for committed matings. And we can see that if we look at the actual matings and we sort on sire, and we go down to Rodney, and we'll see that CM equals -1 is in the list, committed matings equals -1, and if you read the manual, -1 is the tag that this is a committed mating. So there's Rodney, all his 6 matings are committed matings, and that is why when we show sire use, his max use in actual fact is the 6 matings that are in the CommittedMatings.txt file, because he's not listed as a candidate in the main data file. When you do get your mating list, and here it is, you'll find that end use is the column it is used to identify whether a mating is a committed mating or not. And -1 is a committed mating, whereas in this case with multiple end uses not being used, all the others are just a 1 for a normal mating. And select only the matings that are end use 1, and those are your new matings for application. Well, that's the end of this video on committed matings. It's been taken up quite well, and hopefully you find it is tractable to use and gives you better results. Thank you for listening.